The coat did not belong in that lobby. It was the kind of observation people made without meaning to. The kind that arrived before manners had a chance to catch up. A heavy-duty canvas work jacket, the color of old moss, worn soft at the elbows and collar. The kind of coat you'd see on a man who spent his winters outdoors, and his summers trying to recover from them. It hung on the man's shoulders the way clothes do when they've been washed too many times in too cold water, faithfully, but without ceremony. Around him the lobby of Harrington and Vale Financial Group gleamed. Marble floors polished to a mirror finish, a reception desk made of something dark and expensive. The kind of space that said quietly but firmly that certain people belonged here and certain people did not. The man wearing the coat was named Colin Sutter. He was 41 years old, stood just under 6 feet, and had the kind of hands that told a story without needing words. Knuckled, slightly rough. The hands of someone who had spent years working with them. His hair needed cutting by about 3 weeks. There was a small stain on the left sleeve of his coat that looked like it might have been apple juice, which it was, because his 8-year-old daughter Maeve had grabbed his arm at breakfast that morning, and he hadn't had time to change before making the 40-minute drive into downtown Vancouver. He had arrived 12 minutes early. That should have meant something. Instead, the woman at the reception desk, young, composed, wearing a blazer the precise color of a corporate directive, looked at him the way people look at something that has turned up in the wrong place. Not unkind exactly, just certain. "Can I help you?" she asked, in the tone that means the opposite. "Colin Sutter," he said. "I have a 9:30 with the Halverson Group. Strategy session." A pause just long enough to communicate doubt. "Let me check on that," she said, and her eyes moved to her screen with a particular kind of slowness. He waited, stood with his hands loose at his sides, the way a man stands when he has learned not to fill silences with explanations. He had checked in at the security desk, he had his visitor badge, he had driven 40 minutes through early morning highway traffic with Maeve singing the same song from the back seat on a loop. Something about a cloud that wanted to be a bird. And he had kissed the top of her head at the school drop-off line, and told her he'd be there at 3:15, no later. He intended to keep that. But the lobby of Harrington and Vale had not yet decided what to do with him. Colin had not planned to become essential to anyone that year. 3 years earlier, the plan had looked very different. He and his wife, Michelle, had been building something together. A life that felt solid, the kind you could trust to hold your weight. They had Maeve, who was 5 then and already devastatingly funny in the way small children are, when they're not trying to be. They had a house in Burnaby with a leaky tap in the upstairs bathroom, and a backyard big enough for Maeve to run in circles until she fell down laughing. They had plans. Michelle died in February, on a Tuesday, of a brain aneurysm that no one had known was theirs. That was the sentence Colin had spent 3 years learning to say out loud, without his voice, doing something strange in the middle of it. He was not always successful. Afterwards came the grief, which was enormous and shapeless, and resisted all attempts to manage it. And underneath the grief, running parallel to it like a second river, came the logistics. Because Maeve was 5 and needed lunch, and needed baths, and needed someone to read to her at night and check under her bed and remember her library book and pack her snow pants. Life did not pause for grief. Maeve needed him functional, so he became functional. Not because it was easy. Because she was 8 now and still needed him, and that requirement had turned out to be one of the more useful things in his life. The work had helped too, in its way. Colin was a systems integration consultant. He solved the kind of infrastructure problems that large organizations paid a great deal of money to not have. He had spent 15 years becoming very good at it, building the kind of reputation that traveled by word of mouth through boardrooms he was rarely invited to sit in. He was not flashy. He did not attend conferences or maintain a LinkedIn profile with a professional headshot. He drove a 12-year-old Subaru Forester, with a cracked dashboard, and a car seat still installed in the back, and he showed up when called, and he fixed things. 6 months ago, he had been brought in quietly, to look at a systems failure affecting the Halverson Group, a mid-sized investment firm operating out of Vancouver, that had been hemorrhaging operational efficiency at a rate their internal teams couldn't diagnose. 3 separate consulting firms had tried before him, each had produced a report. None had produced a solution. Colin had spent 4 weeks reading those reports, then another 2 weeks, doing the thing the previous consultants hadn't, which was actually going into the infrastructure and looking. What he found was not elegant. It was a patchwork of legacy systems stitched together over 15 years of growth, each acquisition adding a new layer of technology that hadn't been fully reconciled with what existed before. It was like trying to renovate a house by adding rooms without ever drawing a floor plan. He had not solved it entirely yet. But he had mapped it in a way no one else had, and 3 weeks ago, someone at the firm had described his analysis to someone at Harrington and Vale, which was where the Halverson Group kept its strategic accounts. And now he was standing in a marble lobby in a canvas work jacket, waiting to be confirmed. The elevator arrived at the 14th floor and opened into a hallway carpeted in something gray and serious. A man in his 50s met Colin there, Martin Yee, the Halverson Group's head of operations, who had been the one to originally call Colin 6 months ago and who had since then treated him with the uncomplicated respect of someone who understood what they were dealing with. "Colin, good you're here." Martin shook his hand with both of his. "Conference room's ready. Just a heads up, Diane Whitmore's in the meeting." Colin had heard the name, most people in Vancouver financial circles had. Diane Whitmore was the managing director of Harrington and Vale's institutional investment division. A position she had held for 11 years, having climbed there through a combination of sharp analytical intelligence and the kind of demanding standards that occasionally crossed the line between rigorous and withering, depending on who you asked. She was 53. She had been profiled in business publications. She ran a meeting the way some people drove on highways, fast, in the left lane, expecting everyone else to move. "Good to know," Colin said. The conference room was long and glass-walled, with a view of the inlet on clear days, though today was not a clear day. 8 people around the table, varying degrees of preparedness. Colin took the chair he was directed to and set his bag down. A regular canvas tote, with a broken strap, he'd been meaning to fix for months, currently held shut with a carabiner clip he'd borrowed from Maeve's backpack hook. Diane Whitmore sat at the head of the table. She was precisely as composed as her reputation suggested. In a charcoal blazer and reading glasses she wore, with the authority of someone who did not require them to see. She looked at Colin when he sat down. It was not unfriendly, it was the look of someone rapidly completing an assessment. Whatever the assessment concluded, she did not share it. The meeting began. 3 minutes in, something happened that would matter later. Diane's assistant appeared at the door with a note. Diane read it, said something brief to the assistant, and then excused herself for what she described as a 5-minute call. On her way out, she passed the window that looked down onto the street below, and stopped. Down on the street, parked in the visitors' zone that fronted the building, was a 12-year-old Subaru Forester, with a cracked dashboard and a car seat in the back. Diane Whitmore was known for many things, attention to detail was among them. The visitors' zone had a 2-hour limit, but the building management had standing instructions about vehicles that looked. She would later struggle to find a word for what she meant, and would settle uncomfortably on out of place. The zone was typically used by clients attending meetings on the upper floors. The Forester looked like it had wandered in from somewhere it didn't belong. She stepped into the hallway and spoke quietly with building security. 4 minutes later, the Forester was flagged for removal. Colin did not know this yet. He was in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor, pulling a folded printout from the carabiner-clipped bag, explaining load distribution failures, in terms that were making the firm's senior technical director sit forward in his chair. The meeting had been scheduled for 90 minutes. By minute 30, it had changed shape entirely. This happened, sometimes when Colin started talking through a problem he'd spent real time inside. It wasn't performance. It was just what happened when someone who had been quietly doing the work was finally in a room with the people who needed to understand it. He moved through the failure architecture of the Halverson system, the way you move through a building you've memorized, not showing off. Just knowing where everything was. The technical director asked questions. Colin answered them with the kind of specificity that comes from having actually looked. A senior analyst pulled up figures on her laptop and started annotating. Someone on the risk side of the table who had barely spoken in the first 20 minutes said, suddenly, "Can you go back to slide 4? The reconciliation gap? There was no slide 4. Colin had printed a one-page summary and was working from his own notes. But he went back to the point the risk analyst meant, and walked through it again, slower. The room was doing the thing rooms do when something real is happening in them. Becoming quiet in a productive way, rather than a polite one. Diane Whitmore returned from her call at the 50-minute mark. She took her seat and caught Martin Yee's eye. Martin gave her the slight nod of someone who was watching something go unexpectedly well. She turned her attention to Colin, who was at the whiteboard now, a physical whiteboard, old technology, the Markar kind. Sketching out a remediation pathway that the firm's previous consultants hadn't suggested because it required understanding the infrastructure at a level they hadn't reached. She listened for 10 minutes without speaking. Then she asked a question, sharp, specific, the kind designed to locate the edges of what someone actually knows, rather than what they're comfortable presenting. Colin answered it directly, acknowledged the one element that remained genuinely uncertain, and explained why the uncertainty didn't affect the core of the remediation approach. Diane Whitmore's expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled, in the way a calculation settles, when the final number confirms what you suspected. At the 90-minute mark, Martin called a brief break. Colin stepped out to the hallway to check his phone. There were 2 messages from Maeve's school that he hadn't seen. A reminder about the field trip permission form, due Friday, and a photo from her classroom teacher of the class, doing a science project involving baking soda and vinegar, in which Maeve was visible at the far left with a safety goggle pushed up on her forehead, and an expression of deep scientific satisfaction. He was looking at this photo when Martin appeared beside him. "Your car's been towed," Martin said quietly. "I just found out." Colin looked up from the photo. "My car, downstairs. Building security flagged it about 40 minutes ago." A pause. "I'm sorry, I don't think anyone knew it was yours." Colin stood very still for a moment, then he looked down the hall toward the elevator, and then back at his phone, and then at the time. It was 11:14. Maeve's school ended at 3. "What's the name of the towing company?" he said. Martin did not know the name of the towing company. He went to find out. Colin went back into the conference room, because the meeting was not finished, and finishing it had not become less important in the last 60 seconds. He sat down, he turned to the page in his notes where he had been, he continued, he did not say anything about the car, not out of strategy. Bitterness would not get the Forester back, and it would not get him to Burnaby by 3:15, and it did not serve the work in front of him. So he set it somewhere, internal. The way single parents learn to set things internally, in a kind of running hold file that gets processed later, after bedtime. And he continued the meeting. It was Diane Whitmore who noticed. Because she was the kind of person who noticed things, which was how she had gotten to where she was. She noticed that Colin had returned from the break with a very slight change in his posture. Nothing's most people would catch, but she caught it. She noticed that Martin Yee had returned 30 seconds later, looking like a man who had delivered bad news. She noticed that Colin's phone was face down on the table, in a way it hadn't been before, and that he had not looked at it since. She filed this information, and continued the meeting. At 12:40, Colin finished walking through the final stage of the remediation model. There was a silence of the particular quality that follows a clear and complete answer to a complicated question. The senior technical director said, "I want to say, for the record, that this is the first time in 8 months I actually understand what we're looking at." A few heads around the table moved in the small way that indicates agreement. Diane Whitmore set down her pen. She looked at Colin directly. "What would it take to retain your services exclusively through the completion of this project?" The question landed with a particular weight, and the room shifted the way rooms do, when something has moved from exploration to intention. Colin looked at her steadily. He said that he would need to know the timeline and the scope, and that he would need reasonable access to their infrastructure team, and that he worked best when the engagement was defined clearly at the outset, to avoid the kind of scope creep that had complicated the previous consultancies. Direct, unembellished. The answer of someone who knew what they were worth, without needing to perform it. Diane nodded once, as if something had been confirmed. "Then let's have that conversation." It was at this point that Martin leaned toward her and said something quietly. Her expression shifted, just the eyes, briefly. And she looked at Martin, and then at Colin, and then she said, "Martin tells me your car was towed." The room did not know the context yet, but something in how she said it, the word your, carrying a particular weight, made two of the analysts look at each other. "About an hour ago, yes," Colin said. A pause, the length of a breath. "That was my call," Diane said. She said it clearly, without the particular brand of managed vagueness that people in her position sometimes deploy when facing accountability in a public setting. She said it the way someone says something they have decided to say, knowing it will cost them something. The room understood immediately. The way rooms do when the story assembles itself from available parts. The way people understand when cause and consequence arrive in the same sentence. Diane Whitmore, managing director, had looked at a 12-year-old Forester in the visitor's zone, and made a decision based on what she saw, and the 12-year-old Forester had belonged to the man who had just spent 90 minutes demonstrating, with some thoroughness, what competence actually looked like. No one said anything. Colin said, "I know." There was a particular quality to what happened in the next several minutes, that the people in that conference room would describe differently, depending on who you asked, but would all agree was not comfortable. Two of the analysts were already on their phones before Diane had finished speaking, coordinating with building security about the towing company's name and location. Martin was asking someone from facilities for the address. The technical director, who was not involved in any of this, operationally, had stood up and was standing by the window, which was not useful, but was the thing he did when he was processing something. Diane stayed seated. She looked at Colin. "I made an assumption," she said, "about your vehicle, about what that meant." A pause. That was wrong. It was not a soft apology. It did not have the soft managed quality of corporate regret, the kind that comes pre-packaged with a legal team's review. It was the uncomfortable kind. The kind where a person who is not accustomed to being wrong says clearly that they were wrong, in front of an audience, and does not soften it. Colin listened to it in full. He did not wave it away. He did not make it easier than it was. He had been dismissed before, not for the first time and, he suspected, not for the last, and he had learned that accepting an apology did not require pretending the thing hadn't happened. "I appreciate that," he said. "I need to be at my daughter's school at 3:15. The practical statement landed with more weight than almost anything else he could have said. Because it was not an accusation, it was simply what was true. And what was true was that a man who had just saved this organization somewhere between $40 and $60 million in projected operational losses needed to pick up his 8-year-old from school. And his car was in a tow yard somewhere in the city. The facilities coordinator had the address in 4 minutes. Martin offered to have a car sent immediately. Colin said he would prefer to retrieve his own vehicle. Martin accompanied him downstairs personally. So did two of the analysts. Not because it had been arranged, because, as one of them said later, it felt like the right thing to do, and no one had been in the habit of examining that feeling too closely in that building until that particular Tuesday. The tow yard was 12 minutes east of downtown, in a part of the city that smelled like diesel and salt water and was honest about what it was. The Subaru Forester stood in a row of vehicles with the particular look of things removed from where they were supposed to be. The fees were covered. Harrington and Vale's facilities office handled this before Colin arrived. And the car was brought forward by a man in a high-visibility vest who, like most people in his profession, was efficient and non-judgmental about the circumstances that had put the vehicle there. Colin stood by the Forester for a moment before getting in. It was not a dramatic pause. He was checking that Maeve's extra sweater was still in the back because she had a tendency to forget that she had left it there, and then insist she needed it. The sweater was there. He got in. The dashboard had a crack along the right side from the previous winter. Ice in the parking structure at the hospital, where he'd spent 6 consecutive days when Maeve had pneumonia 2 years ago. A story for another time. The seat remembered him. The engine turned over on the first try, which it did with a frequency that continued to be slightly surprising given its age, and he pulled out of the yard and into the city traffic and drove. On the drive back, he thought about Michelle. He did this sometimes in cars. Driving was the kind of activity that occupied the procedural part of his brain, and left the rest of it available for things he didn't have time for in the ordinary run of a day. He thought about what she would have said about the morning, because she had always been very funny about things that were frustrating. Not dismissively funny, not the kind of funny that was really just anger wearing a different coat, but genuinely, precisely funny in a way that reframed things without minimizing them. She would have had something good about the tow yard. About the particular irony of the situation. He could almost hear the shape of it, if not the exact words. He drove. Maeve came out of the school at 3:17, 2 minutes late, because she had been finishing a drawing, and her teacher had let her complete it, which was the kind of thing that Maeve's teachers did for Maeve, and which he was grateful for every time it happened. She was wearing her backpack on both shoulders, which she only did when she was carrying something fragile, and as she got closer he could see that she was holding something cupped between both hands at waist height. "Dad," she said, with the urgency of someone who has been waiting to say a thing. "I made a volcano, I saw," he said. "Your teacher sent a photo." She stopped walking. "She sent you a photo? You were wearing your safety goggles." "I pushed them up," Maeve said with the specific emphasis of someone clarifying a matter of record. He crouched down to look at the volcano, which was made of papier-mâché and painted with a red and orange that had mixed into a shade somewhere between lava and rust. It was slightly lopsided on the left side. It was the best volcano he had ever seen. "That's excellent," he said. "It actually erupted," she said. "With went everywhere, I could tell from the photo." She looked at him for a moment with the particular attention children bring to the faces of the people they know best. "Are you tired?" she said. He had the coat still on, the canvas work jacket, slightly damp now from the tow yard. He had a smudge on one sleeve from somewhere in the last several hours, and the week's tiredness was probably visible in the way he was holding himself, because Maeve had always been able to read him better than he'd managed to read himself. "A little," he said. "It was a long morning. Did it go okay?" "Yeah," he said, "it went okay." She nodded, processing this with the seriousness she brought to information she considered important. Then she held out the volcano. "You carry it," she said, "because I might trip." He took it carefully in both hands. It was light and a little fragile, and he held it level. They walked to the Forester. He buckled the volcano into the front passenger seat with the seatbelt, which made Maeve laugh in the way that filled up a car entirely. 2 weeks later, Colin signed a consulting agreement with Harrington and Vale and the Halverson Group, jointly. A 12-month engagement, at a rate that represented more income than he had earned in the previous 4 years combined. He paid off the last of Michelle's medical bills. He started a savings account for Maeve's education that he'd been meaning to start for 2 years. He hired a part-time assistant, mostly to handle scheduling, because the administrative part of freelance work had been consuming time that should have been going elsewhere. He did not buy a new car. He did fix the cracked dashboard eventually, because Maeve had decided it looked like a river on a map and had begun naming the tributaries, and he didn't want to disrupt her geography. The car seat was still in the back. He would probably need it for a few more years, until she was tall enough for a booster and then old enough that it wouldn't be required. But not yet. He kept the moss-colored work jacket too. Washed the apple juice stain out properly, finally, with something Maeve found under the sink and was very proud of. The stain came out. The jacket remained. Diane Whitmore made a change, in the months that followed. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind of change that announces itself. The kind that happens when a person of genuine intelligence encounters a clear example of their own blind spot, and decides to do something about it rather than reclassify what they saw. She did not discuss this publicly. She did not need to. The people who worked for her noticed that she had begun to ask, in meetings, more questions before drawing conclusions, that she had developed a habit of pausing before the kind of judgment that used to come quickly, that when she interviewed consultants or vendors, she had started spending more time on the substance of what they were saying, and less on the presentation of how they'd arrived. One of her senior analysts, in a conversation that was not intended to be reported but was, said simply, "Something changed with Diane this year. She got more careful about what she thought she could see at first glance." Whether this was directly connected to a Tuesday morning in November and a 12-year-old Subaru Forester in a visitor's zone, no one said outright. But the people who had been in that conference room knew what they knew. The Halverson Group's operational efficiency improved significantly over the following 8 months. The remediation model Colin had outlined proved more effective than the most optimistic projections. The firm reduced its annual infrastructure losses by an amount their communications team later described, carefully, as substantial. The actual figure, $63 million over the fiscal year, being the kind of number that tends to travel quietly through certain circles in Vancouver, and arrive, eventually, in the ears of people who are paying attention. Colin did not attend the press briefing. He was in Burnaby, at a school gym, watching Maeve's class perform a 45-minute play about the water cycle in which Maeve had been cast, against all reasonable typecasting. As the sun, she wore a yellow cape made from a garbage bag and tinsel, and delivered her 2 lines with the absolute certainty of someone who had been rehearsing them for 3 weeks, and intended to be heard from the back row. He sat in a folding chair in the 3rd row, in the moss-colored jacket, which still looked like it had been washed too many times in too cold water. He had a program that Maeve had made him promise to keep. He kept his phone in his pocket. He clapped loudly when she delivered her lines. She found him afterward in the crowd and said with the urgency that had now become familiar, "Dad, did you hear me?" "Everyone heard you," he said. She considered whether this was a compliment or a correction. "Good," she decided, and took his hand. They walked out of the gym into the winter evening, the Vancouver skyline faint in the distance, the air cold and clean, the kind of evening that arrives in November without apology, and stays until it is ready to leave. He had a long drive home. Maeve would fall asleep before they reached the highway. The way she did, with her head tipped sideways, and her seatbelt holding her in place, and the volcano from 2 weeks ago still riding the front seat, because she had asked him to leave it there. He would drive carefully. He always did.